Thank you. My name's Jane MacDonald, and I would like to thank Jamie and Rod and Low Carb Down Under for the opportunity to tell my personal diabetes story. I've been living with type 1 diabetes for 24 years now. I was a late onset diabetic, first diagnosed at age 35 during my first pregnancy. And I was blissfully unaware that I was actually a type 1. I just assumed because I was diagnosed whilst I was pregnant that it would be gestational. And it wasn't until towards the last week of my pregnancy when I said to my endocrinologist, I'll be glad when all this palaver is over. And he said, what palaver, what are you talking about? Well, you know, these injections and finger prick blood tests. And he was like, why would it ever be over? Then I was, whoa, I didn't realise that. I have a strong family history of type 1 diabetes. So my brother became a diabetic at age 13. Two of my nephews, both diagnosed in their 30s, one in his mid-30s, but misdiagnosed as type 2 initially, and then the second nephew on his 40th birthday. And I suspect that my dad's mum must have at least had gestational diabetes. If my dad was still alive today, he would be 98, and he and all his siblings were 13 pounds or heavier at birth, which makes me cringe because my grandmother was a little 4'10" Irish woman, and all home births doesn't bear thinking about. So it's a real challenge to live as a diabetic. There are 42 factors that impact your blood sugar as a type 1 diabetic, and you just can't juggle 42 balls at once. So things that impact your blood sugar, sometimes it's things that I could have control of, but often not. So things like sleep, dehydration, stress, exercise, hormones, the weather, altitude, caffeine, alcohol, medications, and the timing of insulin and food. And obviously food, but not just food, like what type of food, how much carbohydrate am I eating, how much protein, how much fat. So the other real stress about being a diabetic is that almost every health condition has diabetes as its number one risk factor. So I used to feel like I was just living with a time bomb ticking. So this slide shows back in 2016 my Libre flash glucose monitor measures over 2.5 months. So you can see at the top of the scale there's like a flat line of little dots. So every little dot is a time that I've actually scanned the flash monitor, and that's what my blood sugar reading was. So sometimes it's so high it's off the scale, other times it's dangerously low. The two horizontal lines are showing the target, and the blue line is showing my average. So you can see from that the little dots are all over the place, and my average is never within target. As well as that, diabetics realise how horrible and debilitating it can be to have a hypoglycemic impact or episode. 1 minute I'd be feeling fine, the next minute I'd be shaky, really confused, I couldn't see very well, and I'd be slurring and appear to be drunk. And that can be really humiliating, embarrassing. It can happen at work. I was worried it would happen when I was driving. And 3 times in my life as a type 1 diabetic, I've had really low blood sugar where it's taken over an hour to get my blood sugar up. And had I not been lucky enough to be with my family at those 3 times, I wouldn't be here today. Because when my blood sugar is that low, all I want to do is go to bed. And if I'd been alone, I would have gone to bed and I wouldn't have got up. Also, every quarterly appointment for 20 years, visiting my endocrinologist, where my blood glucometer and all this data would be looked at, was just humiliating. It's demoralising. I'm sitting there while they're looking at that. I'm depressed. I'm feeling like a failure. I've followed all the conventional dietary and medical advice, and I've done my best, and that's what it looks like. And my best just is never good enough. And again, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm sitting here living with this ticking time bomb. So fortunately for me, my sister Anne heard from a friend about low carb down under and about Troy Stapleton's video managing type 1 diabetes with a low carb approach. So I watched that video. I found Dr. Richard Bernstein's book of diabetes solutions, and I went to my endocrinologist and said, I've heard about this, what do you think? Can I give it a go? Yes, by all means, he said, but it won't be sustainable. So I was like, okay, I've been given the medical approval, I will give it a go. So within 3 months, I had some really significant general health improvements. I lost the 14 kilos that I'd slowly put on over the 20 years of being on insulin. I halved the amount of insulin I needed. All my inflammation disappeared. I'd had 2 frozen shoulders at once and ended up having surgery on one of them, and that started to recur. So I was getting really depressed about that, the joy of looking forward to all that pain again. I had terrible seborrheic dermatitis all over my face, and that all disappeared as well. But not only that, it was the general benefit of going low carb. My mental acuity improved, my concentration and memory improved, my mood improved. Before I would come home from work and I would just be thinking, oh my gosh, now I've got to look after the kids, make dinner. I don't know how going to have the energy to do that. So it was a revelation that suddenly I had all this energy. I didn't used to be able to drive for more than an hour before I'd literally be falling asleep at the wheel. I live in Mildura in northern Victoria, and I now regularly drive 6.5 hours to Melbourne, and I can do that drive easily on my own, no problem. So not only were there general health benefits, but huge benefits to my diabetes management. So Dr. Richard Bernstein's law of small numbers makes absolute sense. If you're eating small amounts of carbohydrate, you're taking small amounts of insulin, there's a smaller room for error, no bad hypos, and no over-correcting any hypos. So no more roller coaster blood sugars. And it makes sense to me that if I can't metabolise carbohydrate, why are the doctors telling me to make that the basis of every meal I eat and to eat lots of carbohydrate snacks as well? I mean, they don't tell people with a nut allergy, just eat all the nuts you want and take as much insulin, adrenaline as you need to counteract that. So it just didn't make sense to me. But you can see here, so these were a typical day. The 2 slides, the 2 photos on the left, a typical day before low carb of my blood sugars. So really the roller coaster, dangerously low, red low blood sugar and too high blood sugar. Compared to the third photo, which is just what happened, 2 weeks later on the low carb. And this is my pathology report. So I was really looking forward to my doctors seeing this and congratulating me on the improvement I've made. Sadly, that didn't happen. But I can see here my 3 monthly average blood sugar, my hemoglobin A1C, doing everything I was told to do, was still not as low as I would like it to be, 6.8. And shortly after, 5 months later, there it was at 5.3, and that's been sustainable. So for 4 years now, my blood sugars have been in the non-diabetic range, using half the amount of insulin. I also now use a continuous glucose monitor, a Dexcom, and every Sunday I look forward to my email and text from Dexcom, from my data. It tells me how long in range I've been. So the Dexcom higher end of range is 10, and for me that's too high, so I've lowered mine to 8. If it was at 10, I would have been in range 100% of that week, but even when I've lowered it to a range that I'm more comfortable with, I'm still in around 85% of range. So this shows that back in 2016, my flash glucose monitoring difference. So you can see just by changing the food I ate and taking half the amount of insulin I was taking before, my average was in range all the time. The highs were never anywhere near what they were pre-low carb, and my lows I've worked on since to even improve that. But diabetes management isn't just about data. It's a real burden living with diabetes when you're being set up to fail. The emotional fatigue, the anxiety of not knowing, like in 5 minutes, is my blood sugar going to crash? Am I going to be an embarrassment at work? Am I going to be misunderstood because of the way I'm behaving, even though it's a medical thing that I have had no control over? I now have no more anxiety about hypos. They don't come out of left field, and if they do, they're easily corrected with a small amount of glucose. I don't have that humiliation anymore going to the doctor for my medical appointments. I don't feel depressed anymore. I don't feel like a failure anymore. So I've tried to not dwell on how angry I am that I wasn't given any of this information by any of my medical appointments over 20 years of struggling to live with diabetes. I'm trying to put a positive spin on it and instead be grateful. So I'm really grateful for my family for looking after me and pointing me in the direction of Low Carb Down Under. I'm really grateful to Low Carb Down Under for a better quality of life. I'm grateful to Troy Stapleton and his initial video that showed me what was possible. And I love all the Low Carb Down Under videos. I listen to them when I'm walking, doing housework, driving. Those videos have really increased my education on general health and made me better understand that every 4 grams of carbohydrate that I eat is metabolised into the equivalent of a teaspoon of sugar. And now that I understand that 1 cup of rice has 10 teaspoons of sugar in it, and 1 banana, 6 teaspoons of sugar, I now understand why I was failing before. And the videos have been a stepping stone for me to understand the impact that protein and fat has on my blood sugars as well. And it's given me way more tools to manage my type 1 diabetes. And I don't understand why this isn't standard training for all diabetics, because without this knowledge, we're just being set up to fail. I'm really grateful as well for the era that I live in, and the country I live in, and the fact that I have access to modern subsidised technology and medication, and to telehealth. So these photos are photos of my brother Greg. So the photo on the left is in 1962 when he was 13 and just first diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and that's him in hospital. He lived in far north Queensland at that time, and he was sitting an exam, and I was a bit shocked to see that little bottle on the desk there. It's actually an ink bottle, so he wasn't even writing his exam with a biro, he was writing with ink, which made me it was a bit of a light bulb moment. I remember now why, if that's the case, he didn't have the benefit of all the modern technology that I have. So he didn't have a glucometer. He had a glass syringe that my mum used to boil. He had needles that my dad used to sharpen with a pumice stone. He did, though, that one benefit he did have was that back then they were told to weigh all their food and consider what they were eating before the introduction of the healthy food pyramid. So for a long time his management was pretty good despite all that. Sadly, the photo on the right was Greg at age 40. He was in hospital at that stage, having had yet another couple of toes amputated because he was then following the conventional, still current today, dietary and medical advice, and had ended up with osteomyelitis and significant infection in his bone. And the only way to deal with that was to amputate. The other thing that Low Carb Down Under, as well as making me grateful, is giving me hope. So the photo of Greg there was taken 2 years before he died. So he was 42 when he died, and by the time he died, he was completely blind. He'd had lots of his toes amputated, and he started to have kidney failure. So I had 20 years of thinking that was going to be my fate. My children used to ask me when they were little, Mum, what do you think you'll be like when you're old? Do you think you'll be like Granny? And I just would change the subject. I didn't dare hope that I would ever grow to be old, or that if I did, I would have a complication-free life. So I'm really hopeful and I'm really grateful And thank you, Low Carb Down Under, for all you do for diabetics. Thank you.